You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
I'd like to welcome back to the program Herbert London, who's the president of the London Center for Policy Research, and he's a guest here with us today. Herbert, it's always a pleasure to speak with you, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, as usual, no surprise. I love your comments with regards to the re-election of Benjamin Netanyahu, who, it's interesting how the media could paint a picture of desperation and how, the likelihood of him losing the election. And, the coverage is just startling. It makes you question the media even more than we already do. Your comments are really spot on, and of course I'll allow you to address them because they're yours. But it's a very interesting coverage, probably more interesting the coverage than the actual election itself.
Well, let me say a word or two about that. My feeling about it is that, one, I'm pleased that Netanyahu won, quite obviously, but most significantly, I'm pleased at the way in which this was covered, or should say displeased with the way in which this was covered by the major media panjandrums. Part of the difficulty is that they didn't want Netanyahu to win. They were obviously, most people in the media were nothing more than a mirror image of what the administration stood for. And the administration did things that are either illegal or certainly immoral, and that was attempt to change the character of the Israeli political environment so that Netanyahu would lose, by investing in One Voice, where $350,000 was given, and also giving a State Department challenge grant to the New Israel Fund for the investment in the Israeli political environment. Now, those are remarkable, absolutely remarkable grants that were given by the United States government to groups within Israel to oppose Netanyahu. When you think about it, the taxpayers of the United States were not involved in this decision. No one said to me, do you want your tax dollars to go for this purpose? It was all done sub rosa. And it's a matter that I think American people should be aware of. This, in some sense, is really a violation of the way in which you want the United States to engage foreign governments. The money that was given through the State Department was given through a fund, a $600 million fund, which is designed to promote political change in the Middle East, and includes countries like Yemen, Algeria, countries that have known no democracy. Now, it's odd that Israel would be included in this mix. And when Israel is included in the mix, they say, well, we want to effectuate change in the Israeli political environment. Well, what does that mean? It's already a democracy. So when you talk about affecting a change, what you're saying, in effect, is you do not want the administration to be in power. The New Israel Fund that received this money is a left-wing group that had eyes on this election and thought that they could get Herzog elected. They even bust in Arab groups in order to influence the election result. So I was very, very pleased that Netanyahu pulled out a victory, but very much displeased by the way in which the United States government conducted itself, as well as the media panjandrums, as I suggested, who clearly were on the administration side and wanted to see Netanyahu lose. So for a lot of very good reasons, Netanyahu's victory is more than a victory for Israel. It's a victory for those of us who care about the appropriate behavior for the American government and the appropriate behavior for a media group that should be dispassionate in its analysis.
Very well said. It is unbelievably troubling to me as an American citizen and as somebody who pays careful attention, as you do, to what's happening to the canary in our coal mine, Israel. And the fact that our government, who refused to back regime change against the radical Islamist government in Tehran, who made it clear they want us dead, and yet wants to conduct regime change politics against an ally, a democratic ally, as you pointed out, is utter insanity. Now, the irony here is I think it actually worked to his disadvantage from a foreign policy perspective, because I have spoken to various friends in leadership roles in Israel, many of whom told me that they support Netanyahu from a foreign policy, national security perspective, but many people do not support the way he's handled domestic politics. And I think the fact that Obama was so overtly pushed in there may very well have worked against him. So I want to transition that to asking your opinion on basically the following consideration. It seems that we have gone from a primarily bipartisan foreign policy, national security-based support of Israel, where no matter who was in office, you knew we had each other's backs, to this new scenario where we seem to be bending our domestic divide, meaning Democratic-Republican divide, to our foreign policy with Israel. I wanted to see if you agree with that analysis, and if so, what do you think are the risks and implications of this?
Well, I think there are very serious risks, and I think your analysis is correct. Foreign policy has become partisan. It was never a partisan issue in the past. Again, I'm not precise about that moment in the past when it changed, but there is no question that it has changed, and that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party now use the foreign policy of the United States as a litmus test for where they stand on a whole variety of other issues. So I think that it is a test, and it's a very dangerous test. One used to think that Israel was supported by both parties, and one would have assumed as well that Israel, representing the interests of the United States in the Middle East, would be embraced by Democrats as well as Republicans. During the last convention, Democratic convention, I recall the very fact that a number of people started to boo and hiss when the mention of Israel occurred during the course of those deliberations at the convention center. I was startled. I never thought I would see that in the United States, but I did see it, and now I see it more manifest in the way in which this administration is responding. The rapprochement with Iran is clearly designed to create a very different kind of Middle East, a Middle East where Iran is regarded as a stabilizer. If that is true, Israel is thrown under the bus. It's irrelevant to the future perspectives of the United States. We are saying we're throwing in our lot with the Iranians. And in fact, you already see signs of it, since the Iraqi army, the Iranian army, and American logisticians are working together as I speak to defeat ISIL. So here we have the United States working with a presumptive enemy to defeat yet another enemy. And what it means, in effect, is that Israel is largely outside the realm of this equation. And the reason why I say outside the realm of this equation is during the course of these nuclear deliberations, the supreme leader of Iran, Khomeini, made the comment, there is no cure for Israel, there's only annihilation. So the same people who are engaged in promoting the annihilation of Israel and talking about the annihilation of Israel are now working with American logicians to defeat ISIL. This is a very, very strange set of conditions. So it strikes me that what has happened is the United States has put Israel in a subordinate position. Menendez, who is a Democrat, a senator from New Jersey, raised the point that we have to look at additional sanctions if these deliberations continue over Iran's nuclear weapons program. The President of the United States said to him, well, obviously you're referring to your supporters, your financial supporters, an oblique reference to the Jewish people who have supported Menendez in previous elections. Well, that was an outrageous and insulting comment to make. Menendez made that comment not because of supporters in the Jewish community, but because he believes that it's correct. He believes that it's consistent with American goals and American policy. But to suggest that also suggests that the Jewish influence in the United States is declining, that this administration doesn't really care about the future of Israel, and that we've thrown in our lot, or I should say the administration has thrown in its lot with the Iranians as the future stabilizers in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's really incredible. Herb, I want to mention something because I've heard a lot of retired military, including Mullen, and politicians on both sides talking about the Iranian involvement in the Middle East, especially against ISIS. And in the same breath, you hear that we understand that Iran has backed or has been involved in the murder, killing, or death of many Americans for decades now, including recently. However, they're an important, component in dealing with this threat. So I don't understand how far we have fallen as a world leader where we can't fight our own battles, that we have to rely on Iran to win. But
I think that the United
States.
Excuse me for interrupting. I was about to say,
sure.
What is truly shocking, of course, is that the United States is unwilling to deploy forces in the Middle East. Were we to do so, I think that we could probably eliminate ISIL in a month, if not sooner. But the problem, of course, is that the United States will not deploy any military forces on the ground. So we are looking for surrogates. And there are surrogates that are available, chosen the wrong team. If you look at the Sunni nations like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, UAE, Kuwait, those nations are prepared to fight. They could pool their resources. They're prepared to fight even against ISIL. They're Sunni nations, but they're prepared to fight against the Sunni crazies. So they are willing to put their boots on the ground, willing to use their F-16s to fight, as already been demonstrated. And yet we do not take advantage of this potential defense condominium that I've talked about on your program before. So we have selected, in my judgment, the wrong side to adopt. If anything, we should be on the Sunni side, not on the Shia side. And it's not as if there's a Shia-Sunni split here, but those nations have come to the recognition, as President El-Sisi has mentioned, that we've got to deal with the violence in our own religion. So they are prepared to go to war to deal with extremism. And yet the United States does not recognize them, does not provide the F-16s that have been promised to Egypt, have not put ourselves in the position where we would work with these nations, have repudiated even Saudi Arabia, once an ally of the United States. So we have created a very different map for the Middle East, a map that, in my judgment, will lead to future dangers and a very perilous position for Israel.
Yeah, and you can't have a foreign policy, Herb, where you're fighting domestically on what side we're even on to create a policy. It's really something that can happen. And I just wanted to mention this in contrast to what we see happening with Russia and Ukraine. You have General Breedlove, who almost seems to just want to increase the conflict. Now, right or wrong, whatever Russia's done, it's really dangerous. And you also have to question, does this administration and the people involved clearly understand what is the most critical threat that we face right now? Because, quite honestly, we've been through this with Russia before, and we could manage diplomatically to deal with that. How can we manage diplomatically to handle Iran when we really have no working diplomatic relation? I mean, is John Kerry a working diplomatic relation?
Well, again, what the United States has done through these Vienna discussions is to create an environment where the United States has made it clear to Iran that we will be accommodative on a variety of fronts if Iran is willing to, one, delay the actual introduction of nuclear weapons, and two, serve as our boots in the ground in the war against ISIL. So we are accommodative and, in fact, using the links that exist in these negotiations in Vienna to talk about a variety of areas that have what are presumed to be mutual interest. I think that this is a very, very dangerous game that's being played, and it's one of the reasons why I applaud Tom Cotton and the senators who wrote that letter. People will say, well, this is a violation of protocol, or this was not the right way to behave, or it's somehow is a repudiation of the president. All of those things may or may not be true, but the most important thing to recognize is the importance of this letter and what it means. It means that the senators learn nothing about these negotiations unless they read the newspapers in the United States. They are not directly involved in any way, shape, or form. The administration refuses to use the word treaty because that, under constitutional provisions, would mean that that Congress would have to review, or the Senate would have to review a treaty. So it's not a treaty. It's an accord. It's an understanding. It's an arrangement, but it looks and acts and quacks like a treaty and should be a treaty. And that's what the senators are saying. Why are you leaving us out of this equation? Why are you suggesting that the Senate has no role to play in reviewing what is taking place? And the reason for that is that I think the administration realizes there would be very strong opposition to the tactics and the strategy that has been employed by this administration.
You know, it's very funny, and I'm not going to sit here and point out and say that the president is Islamic. You know, clearly he tends to support those folks, but I'm going to point out sort of a Taqiya irony here, right? When you look at the way this president performs, if you have somebody who is trained and who fancies himself a constitutional scholar and the smartest man who ever walked on water, add to it, and at the same time lives in utter contempt of the Constitution, you know, that's much worse. It's kind of like when a cop does wrong, it should really, you know, sort of breed rancid upon society, because people look at that and they say, well, you're the guy we're supposed to trust to protect us. And I think I have a problem with that. And when I look at it from that perspective, you always ask yourself, who's the influencers? And I want to get your opinion on, we obviously have people like Valerie Jarrett or Huma Abedin who remain quiet behind behind the scenes, both of whom have great influence recently on our foreign policy. But I wanted to get your opinion on, there seems to be one common thread between some of the influencers, who take sort of the Saul Alinsky approach to chaos being, the foundation with which you can reform or transform, if you will, a society. But then you have somebody like Soros, who takes that from an international perspective, who seems to relish the destabilization of countries because that's how he's made his wealth. Do you put these pieces together in your analysis, and is there something that we should really worry about, particularly with the destabilization both at home and abroad simultaneously, and what that could potentially mean to America and our standing in the future?
Well, America is becoming a very different nation. The confluence of events that you make reference to may very well be part and parcel of the picture, but that involves a fair degree of speculation. There are some things that you do not have to speculate on. After 1979 and the revolution in Iran, Brzezinski and Gates wrote a paper for the Council of Foreign Relations where they said that it's very necessary to consider Iran as the potential stabilizer in the Middle East. Now, that was a very important document because the document ultimately emerged once again when the Iraqi study group met with President Bush the last time around. And Bush, as you may remember, rejected the recommendations of the study group and instead went ahead with the surge in Iraq. And the surge proved to be the right desire on the part of the president, and it did stabilize Iraq for a considerable period, until, of course, our forces left precipitously. But the one part of the Iraqi study group that was taken seriously by Bush was the role that Iran would play in the future. And a lot of consideration was given to that matter. When Gates became Secretary of Defense, he continued to push this argument that he had promoted with Brzezinski. And even though Gates is no longer in office, the paper that he wrote and the position that he's taken was used by Obama. In fact, pushed to lengths that Bush never would have agreed to. But the role that Iran is playing is part and parcel of a strategy that has evolved over a 20-year period. It is not something that is entirely new. It's now dangerous because we have lost sight of the limits to this kind of negotiation and this kind of understanding. But there is no doubt that there is a consistency throughout recent history on this position of Iran. And now we are finding ourselves in the position where we're not only using Iran as a potential ally, we're using Iran as a surrogate for American positions in the area. And that is the great danger. It has upset and challenged American foreign policy. It has alienated allies in the area. It has put the United States in an entirely new position with Israel. And it has in many ways created a kind of parlous state for the United States as well. But it is a position that is entirely not original to Obama. And that's a point that I'm trying to make here. There are a lot of factors that come together with why this administration is acting and what I would regard as a rather peculiar point of view. Point of view has a history and has some antecedents that are worth considering.
Herb, I'm glad that you mentioned all that, and I agree with you. I would add this. I don't think as a policy the United States should be picking a side of Sunni, Shia, or otherwise. I think we should be doing what's in the best interest of the stability of a region and ensuring that international norms and laws are followed. And clearly, allowing Iran to gain power in that region and become the hegemony is not in the interest of really anyone except for Iran. And you're creating a scenario where all of the neighbors have to be looking, whether Saudi Arabia or Egypt or otherwise, have to be looking at this, questioning, one, the leadership of the United States, and trying to formulate their own response for how are we going to handle the rise of Iran. And I'll add this. If Iran goes nuclear, who's next? And we've discussed this with you before, but that is, just a race that's going to come about, and there's no happy ending there. And I want to hear the response from the administration on that. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, look, I'm again, please excuse me for interrupting. I was about to suggest that there's some way to side with the Shia, the Sunni side. I'm not suggesting that. And nor would I ever make that claim. I'm merely suggesting that there are Sunni nations deeply alarmed about Iran and are willing to fight not only against Iran, but against ISIL as well. But the interesting point that you're making here is that on March 31st, an announcement will be made about this deal. The day after is Fool's Day. Now, on Fool's Day, you're going to see proliferation occur throughout the area. You will find that Syria will have nuclear weapons because the Russians are building 2 nuclear plants in Syria as we speak. The Egyptians have been on the phone with the French about having a nuclear facility built in their territory. The Saudis have been on the phone with South Korea as well as Pakistan about getting nukes as well. So we are talking about proliferation. The irony of this is that when the Nobel Prize was given to Obama, and he made his speech in Norway on the Nobel Prize, he said that the overarching responsibility of my role as President of the United States is to prevent nuclear proliferation. And interestingly, what is happening at this moment in 2015 is that the policies of Obama are leading directly to nuclear proliferation. These are all nations that have signed the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And yet, interestingly, these are also the same nations that now will abrogate the NPT because Iran, a nation that was one of the original signatories, will be given permission to violate the NPT and develop nuclear weapons. The only question that is involved in this so-called understanding or deal is not whether, but when. Not whether they will have nuclear weapons, but when they will have nuclear weapons. Is it a 5-year period? Is it a 10-year period? Or is it a shorter period? Is it a period for their breakout because they don't really necessarily follow up on the treaty? They don't necessarily have to adhere to the treaty. After all, the key is part of their mindset. So we are dealing with a very, very strange set of affairs with a president engaged in the very repudiation of his own policy. And let me leave you with one other thought. In an Atlantic interview, very important interview with the President of the United States in 2012, the President said the following, and again I'm paraphrasing, but very close to the actual statement. I do not bluff. I do not bluff. Let me assure you, Iran will not have nuclear weapons on my watch. His comment, and you can look it up. Now, this is the same president that is now saying, well, it may not be on my watch, but they're going to have nuclear weapons. So we are dealing with extraordinary ironies and lies and dissimulation, and we are dealing with a world that is becoming increasingly more dangerous as a consequence.
It's hard to, in my position, believe a lot of what comes out of the president's mouth, and I certainly just go by what the actual facts on the ground are, and I agree with you. Herb, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. I want to give your website, thelondoncenter.org. You guys have a wonderful assembly of experts and fellows there. We really do appreciate the work that you do, and so do not only the United States, but our allies as well. So again, thank you very much, Herb. It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, have a great afternoon. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.